Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on the Social Services Legislation Amendment, Payment Integrity Bill 2019. I move the amendment, which I've just lost hearing, and I move the amendment circulated in my name. Namely, the amendment says that the House, 1, declines to give the bill a second reading, 2, notes that in every budget this government has tried to cut the pension or increase the pension age to 70, and 3, further notes that the cuts to Newstart in this bill will hurt redundant workers and push them towards poverty, and 4, criticises the government for its cruel cuts to pensions and social security. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labor opposes this bill, just as we have opposed the previous iterations of these same old cuts. I also note that we have another bill with integrity in its name before the Parliament. Funny that. It's becoming a bit of a joke, because whenever the word pops up in a bill title, the Australian public can be sure that the contents of the bill will have not a shred of integrity, and certainly these old cuts do not. These old cuts, as I said, were first announced by the then Treasurer and now Prime Minister in the 1617 MAIFO, and then again in the 2017-18 budget. And there was even a so-called Payment Integrity Bill in 2017 in the last Parliament, which was the last vehicle for these cuts. A bill which the government never brought on for debate. But here we are, debating a bill which the government simply should not be putting forward. It is as if the government has absolutely no legislative agenda at all, and bringing this back for the third time demonstrates that. The bill contains more cuts to vulnerable Australians. Debating a bill which the government simply should not be putting forward is what this chamber is doing at this point. More cuts to middle-aged and older Australian workers, more cuts to Newstart, more cuts to the pension, more cuts to the Australians doing it tough. Barely 6 months since the election, and this tired old government is turning to its tired old tricks, more cuts. The bill will rip over $185 million from the pockets of Australian pensioners. It will in particular impact older Australians who want to visit families overseas or need to spend an extended time caring for relatives or grandchildren. It will disproportionately impact on migrant pensioners who have worked hard, paid their taxes, done the right thing and contributed so much to Australian communities. Portability of the pension is a cornerstone of the Australian social security system. It is something that is very much part of the social security system in Australia that we all should be proud of. Migrant pensioners who have worked hard in Australia and who have built a life and a family here should be able to get the pension. Making people wait longer to get the pension will only force some older Australians to go without and struggle or live in poverty. And I remind the government that cuts to pensions not only impact on pensioners themselves, these cuts are felt by the families too, the sons and daughters and the grandchildren as well. Unfortunately, cuts to pensions are nothing new for this government, but pensioners will not be fooled. Cutting the pension is in the Liberals' very being. In every single budget as a Treasurer, this Prime Minister tried to. In every single budget as a Treasurer, the current Prime Minister tried to cut the pension and tried to raise the pension age to 70. In 2014, way back then, the Liberals said there would be no cuts to pensions. Then, in the 2014 budget, they tried to cut pensioner indexation, a cut that would have meant pensioners would be forced to live on $80 a week less within 10 years. This unfair cut would have ripped $23 billion from the pockets of every single pensioner in Australia. In the 2014 budget, they cut $1 billion from pensioner concessions, support designed to help pensioners with the cost of living. In 2014, they axed the $900 senior supplement to self-fund retirees receiving the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. In 2014, the Liberals tried to reset deeming rate thresholds, a cut that would have seen 500,000 part pensioners made worse off. In the 2015 budget, the Liberals did a deal with the Greens to cut the pension to around 370,000 pensioners by as much as $12,000 a year by changing the pension assets test. In the 2016 budget, they tried to cut the pension to around 190,000 pensioners as part of a plan to limit overseas travel for pensioners to 6 weeks. In the 2016 budget, they also tried to cut the pension to over 1.5 million Australians by scrapping the energy supplement for new pensioners. The government's own figures show this would have left over 563,000 Australians who are currently receiving a pension or an allowance worse off. Over 10 years, in excess of 1.5 million pensioners would be worse off. On top of this, they spent 5 years trying to increase the pension age to 70. Mr Deputy Speaker, and more recently we saw the government finally adjust the deeming rates after 5 consecutive rate cuts. The government uses deeming rates to calculate the level of a person's pension, assuming a rate of income from savings, whether or not pensioners actually earn those returns. However, since March 2015, the Reserve Bank has cut the cash rate to a record low, with 1% off to 1%. For years, Labor campaigned for the government to adjust the deeming rates to more accurately reflect the rates of return that pensioners can reasonably expect to receive on secure investments. And for years, the Liberals and Nationals had to be dragged kicking and screaming by pensioner groups and Labor. Only recently, the Prime Minister and his Liberal National Government adjusted the rates to 3%. Seniors groups know that this is simply too little, too late. The government has shortchanged pensioners. It has propped up its budget on the back of hard-working pensioners. And then, of course, the Prime Minister shamelessly went to spruik this deeming rate adjustment as an $800 pensioner bonus. This is, of course, was until he was caught out by his own figures. That less than 1% of pensioners will receive anywhere near this amount. In fact, the figure actually shows that nearly half of pensioner couples will receive less than $130 per year. That's just 36 cents a day. After waiting more than 4 years for the Prime Minister to do something about the deeming rates, this latest revelation simply adds insult to injury. Pensioners have every right to feel concerned and to feel conned. And pensioners won't forget the Morrison Government are continuing to profiteer off pensioners through gouging pensioners with unreasonably high pension loan interest rates. The Age Pensions Loan Scheme allows pensioners to top up their pension by borrowing money against the value of their property and then repaying the loan at the time of the administration of their estate. The scheme currently charges pensioners an interest rate of 5.25%. Since the government took office, the cash rate has fallen from 2.55% to an all-time low of 0.75%. But the government hasn't changed the pension loan interest rate at all. It is up to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to justify how they continue to gouge pensioners by charging these unreasonably high pension loan interest rates. The Morrison Government has displayed rank hypocrisy, accusing banks of profiteering by not passing on the cash rate, but doing the same to pensioners. Labor has fought each of these cuts to the pension tooth and nail, and Labor will oppose the Liberal and Nationals' cruel cut to the pensions in this bill. And to top it all off, we know this government has a fundamentally wrong idea about the pension and social security in general. The Social Services Minister has described the pension as generous and said that giving people more money would do absolutely nothing. Probably all it would do is give drug dealers more money and give pubs more money. Can I be explicit about this particular measure in relation to the age pension? It is particularly going to hit very hard people that have migrated to Australia back in the post-war periods, who take time out whilst they can to visit relatives overseas. It's going to particularly affect the Greek community, the Macedonian community and the Italian community, and people that actually came out here to help build the Snowy Mountains scheme. It will mean that those people, while they are able, of course it's not limited to those groups, as the member for Cowan has said, but it will particularly affect people who, whilst they can, want to go back and visit their relatives, go back and meet their grandchildren, go back and see their children in many cases. And it will mean that they can only go, for 6 weeks, and after 6 weeks this bill will actually bring in the taking away of the pensioner supplement. And it is particularly going to affect communities that have come to Australia, that have been proud Australians, that have committed themselves to this country, that have paid their taxes, that have worked hard, and they should not be penalised in this way. It is also going to change for people that have become citizens of this country, that they will have to wait now 15 years instead of 10 years for the age pension. That is the insidious nature of this particular piece of legislation. Can I go on to the Newstart cuts? This bill is also about cuts to Newstart. This bill will force Australians who are trying desperately to re-enter the workforce to eat into their savings before they can access income support. It will force middle-aged men in their 50s and 60s who have worked hard all their lives, paid their taxes and done the right thing, who have recently been made redundant. This will force them into poverty before they can access support. Currently, people claiming Newstart, sickness allowance, youth allowance and Austudy must wait up to 13 weeks to access the payment if they have liquid assets. For example, savings or a redundancy payout, over $5,500 for a single with no dependents, or $11,000 for someone with a partner or dependents. The existing waiting period at these levels is 1 week and increases up to a maximum of 13 weeks for liquid assets of $11,500 for singles or $23,000 for those with dependents. The government wants to extend the maximum liquid assets waiting period from 13 weeks to 26 weeks. That's half a year. That's half a year for claimants with liquid assets of more than $18,000 for singles or $36,000 for couples and people with dependents. This will mean, let us be clear what this means, there is an expectation that people who have been made redundant, who at the age of 45, 50, 55, will find it very difficult to gain employment quickly. The statistics tell us absolutely that people in those age groups are taking from 2 to 3 years to find other work, and they all want to work, let me assure you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It means that if there is an emergency in the family, like sickness, like the car needing replaced, like removal, relocating, like retraining, that the expectation is no support from the government. The support will come in the form of you have to use all your assets and that redundancy payment before you can even qualify for a social security payment. Now, how is that fair? How is that right for people that have worked all their lives in an industry often that's closed? For example, Mr Deputy Speaker, the car industry in South Australia, no fault of their own. The industry's closed or the industry has relocated, and people in those positions with a modest redundancy payment will not be able to gain access to social security for half a year. Now, I don't understand how people have worked their whole lives, who have contributed their entire lives to this country and to the tax system should be forced into that terrible situation. The psychological pain that some of these people will be going through is absolutely enormous. Now, a liquid asset is not just cash in the bank. Liquid assets include, according to the department, some payments made or due to be made by a person's last employer, including redundancies yet to be made, amounts deposited or lent to banks or other financial institutions, whether or not the amount can be withdrawn or repaid immediately. So there may be actually no assets at all sitting in a bank account. Assets given to a son or daughter in some circumstances, loans to other people, and compensation payments. They're the payments where the expectation is that you have to run those payments down before you're eligible for support from the government. This means that applicants will need to spend down more of their assets before becoming eligible to receive a payment. This is plain mean-spirited. There is no logic, there is no reasonable explanation of these changes other than money gouging. There is no rationale for increasing the liquid assets waiting period for people who lose their job or are made redundant. This is nothing but a cash grab, taking money out of the pockets of workers at the very time when their savings matter the most. The current waiting period of up to 13 weeks is long enough. While some people will find another job in a 13-week period, it is important that those who do not are not forced to run down their savings to the point where they become vulnerable to losing their home or are unable to meet unexpected expenses. We know that for middle-aged and older Australians, re-entering the workforce can be particularly difficult. They face structural barriers to finding a job, as well as workplace age discrimination. We know that middle-aged and older Australians who have recently been made redundant from industries that they have spent their whole life working in. They will require just a bit more time to retrain, to upskill. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I saw on television how things are going in South Australia in relation to the car industry, and speaking to older workers who find themselves in very difficult circumstances on the ABC, and I draw people's attention to that show. Many of these people may need to spend time on further education. The number of Australians over the age of 55 on Newstart has skyrocketed by 45% under the Liberals and Nationals. Over 55 represent the largest cohort, or over a quarter of Newstart recipients. Now, this is critically important to understand. I note the member for Goldstein is leaving. It's a hard fact. It's a hard fact to understand that their profile.
The member hasn't got the call yet. The member for Goldstein.
The member should refer to members by their title. I'm the member for Goldstein.
The member may either leave or sit back down. Continue, please, member for Barker.
It's spelt the same way, go. We know that middle-aged and older Australians who have recently been made redundant from industries that have spent their whole life working in, they will require just a bit more time to retrain, to upskill. They may even need to spend more time, as I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, on further education. The number of Australians on Newstart, as I mentioned, over the age of 55 has skyrocketed, and the number of people over the age of 55 are now the largest cohort, or over a quarter of Newstart recipients. A waiting period that is too long or a liquid assets threshold that is too high is actually counterproductive. It doesn't help people get back on their feet. It pushes people towards desperation. For people who lose their job or are made redundant, having a financial buffer is incredibly important. It means being able to support yourself while retraining, being able to keep the car on the road so that you can look for work and keep paying the rent or mortgage. If a person's circumstances spiral because they run out of savings, if they lose their home or their car, if their white goods or fridge break down, or if a family member gets sick, this just makes it harder to get back into employment. Australians are already doing it tough as it is. The economy is weak and getting weaker, and this government has no plan to turn things around. Many Australians can't remember the last time they received a pay rise. Wages are stagnant, and yet the cost of living is leaving Australians with less. It is more difficult to find a secure job with decent pay and adequate hours. Over 1.1 million Australians remain underemployed. Over 130,000 Newstart recipients, or more than 1 in 5, actually have a job, but just don't earn enough to receive enough hours to escape the payment. The Anglicare Jobs Availability Snapshot 2019 show that there aren't enough jobs for the number of job seekers, with employers receiving an average of 19 applications per vacancy advertised. We are reminded that 3 million, or 1 in 8, Mr Deputy Speaker, Australians live in poverty. 1 in 6 children, or 750,000, live in poverty. These are people in the electorates that we all represent. They are not just statistics. They are real people. At a time when Australians are doing it really, really tough, when the economy is weak and getting weaker, these cuts to the pension and cuts to Newstart are not only cruel and vindictive, but they are also reckless. Not only does the Prime Minister not have a plan for the economy for jobs to lift vulnerable Australians out of poverty, he is cutting support to Australians who need it the most. These cuts to the pension and to Newstart will not only be felt by older Australians and Australians doing it tough. These cuts mean that they will have less to spend on the basics and the essentials. It means they will have less to spend at local businesses. It means local businesses will have less to spend on pay rises or for hire of more staff. Those on Newstart and the pension, but especially those on Newstart, are more likely to spend their payment. The government should be growing the economy and lifting people out of poverty, not taking money out of the pockets of pensioners and workers who have been made redundant through no fault of their own. Under this third-term government, Australia has the slowest growth in a decade, stagnant wages, productivity in decline, record household debt, high underemployment and to declining living standards. The government needs a plan to turn the economy around, not more empty political tactics. There is nothing in this bill that will create jobs or grow the economy. It is vindictive and it is reckless. All it will do is rip money from the pockets of pensioners and those looking for work. As I have said, Mr Deputy Speaker, you just look at the litany, the very good dissenting reports from the Australian Labor Party senators when we looked at the version of this bill from 2017. We already said the committee heard evidence from a wide variety of community organisations that the changes in the bill are unfair and will result in groups of Australians facing significant financial pressure. Catholic Social Services Australia said the bill places the burden of budget repair on those that can least afford it, while providing tax cuts to the wealthy and businesses is wrong morally and economically. The Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia said the extension of the residency requirements for qualifications for DSP and age pension and the removal of the pension supplement after 6 weeks of travel overseas disproportionately impacts culturally and linguistically diverse communities and are therefore discriminatory in nature. and that's the Ethnic Communities Council, the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of Australia, making that very, very salient point. We heard also from the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council of Australia also saying older migrant Australians will become more reliant upon their families to support them. But as with any family, young people now in Australia have to move often in order to secure employment and are not often in a position to take care of their older relatives, either practically or financially. The National Social Security Rights Network said the Australian system is based on residence and needs and need. It has a very strong emphasis on residence already. Most of the older migrants who have the misfortune to need to access our system within the first 10 years in Australia are covered by an assurance from their families, and there is no cost to the taxpayer because the money is recovered from the family. So it's hard to see the case for strengthening the requirements. It's particularly hard to see the need or benefit that comes from introducing income support history into the test. It's a departure from very fundamental principles. In relation to the assets waiting period, the Australian Council of Social Services told the committee the latest HILDA data shows that a full 25% of people who are unemployed are already being deprived of 2 or more essential items. In addition, the evidence shows that about 12% of people at the moment could not rise $500 in the event of an emergency. And the Catholic Social Services of Australia also made the point, the very important point, that even with savings of $36,000 for a person with dependents, it would not take long to expend these savings. For example, using the household expenditure measure, a person with 2 dependents in the ACT renting and having a basic lifestyle would need a minimum of $21,792 over a month period. This assumes there are no contingencies, such as medical bills and the sorts of things that Labor is very much concerned about. It says this leaves households financially vulnerable with a small buffer to manage contingencies while on income support. Can I finish up my contribution, Mr Deputy Speaker, by once again reiterating that Labor moves the amendments circulated in my name that go to declining to give the bill a second reading, notes that this is a reoccurring theme from the government, notes that cuts to Newstart in this bill will hurt redundant workers and push them towards poverty, and finally criticises the government for its cruel cuts to pensions and social security. And as I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor opposes this bill.